Okay.
So as I was saying, communities of practice have been a tool that Campus Compact has used over the years as a way to convene our members to do shared learning across the network, to highlight and tap into the expertise and knowledge of the folks on the ground who are doing this, and really to build community within the field where folks learn from each other. Sharon Lowenstein approached Clayton Hurd, our Director of Professional Learning, who oversees the communities of practice, with an idea around doing a community of practice. She had been a facilitator for other Campus Compact COPs in the past, but she was interested in doing something specifically around white allies and thinking about a white caucus. And so Clayton reached out to me, since I oversee our DEI work at Campus Compact, and shared Sharon's email. And so Sharon and I had the opportunity to talk, and sort of as we were brainstorming, we thought about doing this a little bit broader. And so bringing in some other folks, making it both BIPoC and white, and really utilizing some important strategies around dialogue and connection and anti-racist work to bring this together. So Sharon invited John, and I had known John from his work at UMass Amherst and in the field. And then I invited Aaliyah, who is one of our engaged scholars from our Engaged Scholars Initiative out of our Midwest cohort, who's also a faculty at Cardinal Stritch University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so having worked with Aaliyah in the ESI programming, knowing her passion and skill for this area, and just she's a brilliant scholar and a lovely, lovely person. We brought this dream team together to begin to conceptualize what an anti-racist COP could be, what were the values we wanted to create, the kind of space, especially during the racial justice movements, during a pandemic, during all of these changes that we were experiencing and loss that we were experiencing, both professionally at our institutions. A lot of institutions were cutting back. A lot of folks wanted to think about these issues more deeply. And also, we were in a time of, I think, collective reflection. And so how could we use the space of the COP and delve into this with that idea in mind of creating a sacred space that could bring people together. And then also, I think for us as being, Lee and I being scholars and practitioners of color, the real experiences that we have had within our institutions, the toxic nature of higher ed for all of us, but specifically for BIPoC folks, and then how do we create a space that allows folks that important opportunity to share and connect, especially around issues that make them vulnerable and that are hurtful and traumatic for them. So there were a lot of different things that we were balancing and trying to create in this space, but really bringing intentionality and purpose to it.
Okay, so that's the framing piece from you, Marisol. Thank you. What we'd like to do now is connect the experience that we had in facilitating this community of practice, this COP, with the principles of anti-racist pedagogy in community engaged teaching that were being drawn up and figured out separately from this group. But when the four of us sat down a few days ago to look at that list of principles as a team, we said, well, actually, we've been enacting some of those principles in our work. And so the first bullet under principle 1, if you're just counting 4 principles, principle 1.1 is that we would recognize that the burden of anti-racist training can no longer rest alone on the shoulders of students and educators of color. White faculty and the institution at large must commit time and focus to developing anti-racist practices and structures in their practice. And we couldn't control what the institutions at large were doing, but we could create a space for white faculty and white staff to join with us to figure out how to share the burden of anti-racist training. And we ourselves were figuring out, how do we share that work? And we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. A second principle that stood out to us is guiding principle 2.3, third bullet under principle 2, critical reflection on individual and systemic structural racism, in which we would critically consider the forms that racism and white privilege take in higher education, its impact on knowledge production, and how normative epistemologies affect how we perceive and know the world. And as we critically considered the forms that racism and white privilege took in higher education, we realized very powerfully that white people had some learning to do that was separate from the work of the BIPoC group, that each of those groups had their own necessary agendas that they were bringing to this work. And it required critical reflection, especially for the white folks, I think, on individual systemic and structural racism in higher ed that we white folks need to understand in order to challenge the power and privilege that exist in conventional patterns of behavior on our campuses. And then the third principle we found ourselves already seeking to embody is principle 4.2, which is about creating a compassionate, reflective classroom. And if you think of a compassionate, reflective learning space, not just students in a classroom, but people who have come together to learn in whatever kind of learning space it is co-created. That principle says we need to provide spaces to respond to microaggressions and difficult conversations in ways that facilitate learning and accountability, as well as providing opportunities for repair and healing. And you will hear a lot about how we began to figure that principle out in practice. So what we'd like to do now is take turns, each of us telling a story about a key learning that we had. And after each of us tells our story, the rest of us might respond, as we're moved to do, to that story and amplify it in a way that's very similar to the kinds of planning conversations the four of us had before each of our sessions, because we would say stuff and then we would take it apart and put it back together. And so
if I can add something too.
Okay. You want to add it now?
Yeah, just for context in terms of our planning. And so when you're thinking about this, we took a lot of time. We met for an hour to an hour and a half, in preparation for each of our sessions. And so as we're sharing our stories, think about sort of the time and space that we created in order to be intentional.
Yeah, and I realized that we didn't even say what the design looked like. The first time we ran it, we had an hour orientation session, and then we had 6 sessions for an hour and a half that were bi-weekly. So we had a total of 9 hours plus an hour orientation. The second time we ran it in the summer, we just said 6 sessions, but we did them on a weekly basis. And they ran for 2 hours. So we had a total of 12 hours with people. And neither of those was enough time. We kept wanting to have more time to do this. But we did planning sessions then, as Marisol was just saying, in between each of those meetings. So it was a significant time commitment, and I think a significant community building and group learning process for us, as well as for the other participants. So we're going to share one story each, and we'll see if we have time to do anything else after that. And If you want to put questions in the Q&A, we'll respond to as many of those as we approach the end of our time as we can. But first, the stories. And we'll start with you, Aaliyah. We'll go to Sharon, then to Marisol, and then to me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. I have to say that my story of my key learnings tries to protect the confidentiality and the identities of the folks that I had an opportunity to meet, of course. So I don't use names unless I'm speaking about me personally. A key learning for me is rooted in the methods. It's rooted in the process and the pedagogy of practice upon critical reflection and reflections on what we did and what we continue to do. And then it also always comes back to the fact that I feel like sometimes in my attempts to do something different in higher ed, we can feel very much as though those systems, that structure is not built to support that difference. So I'll start by saying creating an anti-racist community of practice can be achieved through the focus on the need to address some of the structural and systemic issues that we face in terms of racism that were brought to our attention, very similar to some of the issues that were addressed in today's symposium. Creating an anti-racist community of practice that is also anti-colonial is a bit harder to do, particularly in higher education. Higher education is an institution where certain systems and quote unquote progressive isms like capitalism have been fully endorsed and perpetuated by racial injustice. It is important, yet a bit harder to challenge those systems in conjunction with the goal of eradicating racism when we don't have a strong basis of methodologies and practices that we can use to support as counterexamples. There are some practices, some behaviors, some attitudes that run parallel with colonial culture. It is a bit odd for me, considering my background and my diversity of experiences. It's harder to maintain a sense of balance with regard for diversity of culture, namely academic culture, for example, when a space within that space that exists with regard for majority ideology. And the majority ideology oftentimes is this academic culture and the power that lies within that ideology. What's maybe even more interesting is the commitment to anti-colonial cultural practice for those of us who continue to be overrun and inundated by habits that are completely remiss of anti-colonialism. If anti-colonialism isn't intentional, yeah, I do hear that. I'm going to pause.
Can folks please mute themselves?
Okay, should I begin again?
Yes, thank you.
I think what I was trying to say, you know, if we're looking at the practices of higher education and considering the ideology that exists within an academic culture, we can be overrun by colonial practices or habits if anti-colonialism is not intentional, if it's not ingrained, if it's not front of mind. So it was important to unpack and become critically aware of my positionality, of the social, emotional, and psychological toll that this work takes on me as a faculty member of color on a college campus that is already kind of perpetuating certain systems and issues inadvertently, while still trying to support or purport a mission toward justice. It's an oxymoron. While the concept of creating caucus groups or affinity spaces in which Black and Indigenous people can achieve safety and autonomy can be healing, which is what we did, there can exist a sense of conviviality where we're, you know, celebrating, when Black people, for example, can celebrate a sense of belonging. However, too often, what we see is Black and Brown people celebrated in film and music and culture as steadily stratified or separate from a normalized view of attitudes. It becomes something different. The behaviors, the ideas are to be celebrated now in this current state rather than infused and adopted as practice. And that gets to be pretty hard for people, for Black and Indigenous cultures who are perpetually on the margins. The personal and the professional risk associated with speaking to address toxicity, harm, suffering, felt as a result of racism on college campuses and universities, namely anti-Black racism, is oftentimes too much for many souls to bear. The burden of racism continues to harm personal, psychological, physical, professional domains of the people who are consistently negatively impacted, but continue to have to show up for work. So it's exciting to see that so many scholars have begun to articulate and concretize this idea of work in order to offer a resource for understanding. That's not just the what to do, but the how, and how we can do it better. We have a long way to go. Acknowledging the steps in the journey can give us hope amidst what often feels like a bleak and gloomy feat. This just means that there's more work to be done. I'm reminded of Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye. In Toni Morrison's book, in the foreword, Morrison offered a reflection on idleness versus action. And I'm reminded of this reflection and inspired to do more, so that the people who we were able to meet with and be in community with aren't just moved by the stories that were shared or the cause or the experience, but are moved to action. So in the planning and preparation of an anti-racism community of practice, we didn't want people to just be touched by our sessions. We remain largely committed to folks being moved as opposed to remaining unmoved. So we continue to do the work of critical reflection, analysis, disruption, and we commit to collaboration focused on transformative change to perpetually consider the concept of community and the social, political, emotional, psychological oppression of racism as it continues to live out through practice. Perhaps what I've learned is that more than ever before, racial justice is sought as an approach through methods that are currently not the methods of familiarity and comfort, nor are they uniquely positioned to be recognized as such in higher ed. And so while coalition building was a huge learning, a goal and a process for us, and is as important now than it was ever before, it is also this deep sense of humility and vulnerability a person must harness to use to practice transformative methods and process. It takes a lot to wrap your arms around one person and uplift and empower a soul who's been so beaten up over time, especially when there's so much trauma and so much harm that has been inflicted. And my co-facilitators and I were typically emotionally and psychologically exhausted after each session. So our current systems, our current structures and behaviors don't support that, because then we're told now we have to get up and write about it. It might be counterintuitive. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm gonna behave. It might be counterintuitive to the approach that we took, right? The amount of time and energy it takes to truly concretize and envision a process that is anti-colonial is the practice of what we did, what we hope to continue to do, which is consistently praxis. It is the praxis of visualizing the steps in that. The spaces we currently have available for visualization are clouded with the habits of cultural and social hegemony. What happens in the shifting of our imagination of one's own agency is powerful. And maybe the pursuit of replication could be meritorious, right? This is why we meet in community with one another. However, wouldn't that mean that given the unique experiences of the individuals in that space, the outcome might look a little different depending on where the process begins? So how can the goal of justice be truly achieved if we're all starting at different places? Justice is not an individual approach. That was something that we took away with. It is a collective approach, considering the uniqueness of the experiences we've had in our nation state. Maybe replication is not the approach or the only approach to take, but rather momentum building, which leads to change agency, which is consistently informed by injustices of the past, is what needs to happen. And that requires a careful and critical understanding of the injustices that have occurred and continue to occur every day. But this can't be left to sole individuals or Black and Indigenous people of color alone. Might I pause here or should I keep going, John?
I think probably you should pause here because our time is shorter than we even thought it would be. So thank you for that.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. Sharon or Marisol, would you like to speak about something Aaliyah's words triggered for you, or should we go on to the next story? And Sharon, you're muted. And you're still muted, Sharon.
In view of the time, I think we should go on to the next story.
Okay, that would be yours.
Yes, it is. So I want to preface this, first of all, by thanking my colleagues, John, Marisol, Aaliyah. And I want to piggyback on some things Aaliyah just said about we have to move beyond our own familiarity and comfort. So even though I had proposed this COP, we didn't even know what, I didn't even know what I was proposing was a COP. I honestly, I knew I could help some way, but I honestly didn't know how this was going to proceed. And as a white person, and well, the other folks can speak for themselves, I think when we entered into this, we all each had different experiences. And although we had done a lot of planning and continued to do immense planning all the way through, not only meeting beforehand, but we would debrief after. We would be texting each other during the weeks. And during the summer, when we had this going every week, I was very thankful that I wasn't teaching any classes in the summer, because it was the way that we did it, lovingly, enormously time consuming and emotional. And I wanted to, at the risk of, well, I am calling myself out. So I decided in this presentation, I was going to call myself out about an incident that happened that my dear colleagues responded to, because I think how we work together says everything about how this COP unfolded. Since we don't want to name any of the participants, I can name myself. So we were talking, as we did at various parts in this conference day, on what our institutions could do in terms of achieving greater diversity. And I was getting to the point about how, we don't even have great hiring processes and marketing. And when we get resumes and materials, sometimes our supervisors encourage us to look at materials of people who, and this, I'm putting this in quotes now, perhaps weren't as qualified as other people. And at any rate, I could tell in that moment, this was not landing well. And I honestly did not know how to proceed. And afterwards, my three colleagues called me. No.
Someone needs to mute.
Oh, okay. So
Okay.
my three colleagues did what I would say was calling me in. And I don't know how many of you know the work of Loretta Ross, who I've since come to know a little bit. They did this lovingly. They did this in private. They did not do it in the public arena. And they talked from their hearts about why this did not land well on them. And then they paused, and then together we figured out, or I figured out, okay, what is it? What do I now do? After all, I'm supposed to be a facilitator. I'm supposed, at least I thought, I'm supposed to know how to navigate all of this. And I didn't know in that moment. And so we decided, and I decided, I think in my memory, you guys tell me if I have this right. I decided, okay, I'm going to do what I would consider to be calling myself out, which is a form of a public apology. And there were 40 people in this group. And we didn't make a big deal about it. We framed it very nicely. We had a little bit of a discussion. We rooted all of this in what had gone before and what was to come next. And I had to figure out in these moments, I felt like I was developing a kind of dual or triple consciousness, where I had to figure out, how do I want to carry my whiteness? Where did that statement land? How do I pivot from that statement to what else we were doing in this group? And how do I really try to repair the harm that might have been done to some people? And that was like a huge learning for me. And I guess my lesson in this is that in this moment, we, the four of us, continue to co-create, to use this as an example of learning together. So another thing I want to say, not necessarily so much related to this story, but as I step back, as I think about my journey and my understanding of what we really tried to do, we were, of course, trying to create an environment that would help us all move forward in some anti-racist work. But I think we were also doing human rights work. And I'm still learning more about how to do that work on campuses and how to do that work so we really do it with each other, so that we can continue to call each other in rather than call each other out. And as I felt in that moment, hold on to be my best self from my colleagues. So I'm going to stop there and ask, that's my memory of that situation. If anyone wants to add to that, or if we should move on to the third story.
Very quickly, Aaliyah or Marisol, would you like to comment in response to Sharon's story?
I'd say that we encouraged you to address it with the broader group, because we knew that there was harm caused that was experienced by the BIPoC participants in the group. And I will say that you were open to doing that, and I think that became a good demonstration for the BIPoC participants as well as the white participants around centering the participants, and also that this is messy work.
Mm-hmm.
And we can step in it
Mm-hmm.
a lot. And part of doing this work is recognizing when we step on it, cleaning off our shoes, and moving forward with humility and acceptance. And I think you demonstrated that, Sharon.
I think that was well said, Marisol. Thank you. And just to add to that, and thank you so much for sharing that story, Sharon. I think that'll resonate with lots of folks today. It is important to understand that as we try to concretize the language and strengthen our language and capacity for shared understanding, since the language that we use can sometimes be so deeply ingrained in the culture and the practice of racism. And so looking at that action as a step toward understanding was extremely powerful for everyone in that group.
And I also want to say my experience of the interaction, and we don't use this word very much. In fact, we're castigated for it, was one of a kind of love, really. Very rare on college campuses, in my opinion.
My goal is to make that popular and the norm. So
Yeah.
I think I'll go now and share my
Yeah.
story.
Yes, please do.
So I think there's two things that I want to share. One is personal, and the other one is kind of connected to the broader. So I'll do the connected to the broader and then share a bit of the personal. So I think one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we did was center the experiences of the BIPoC folks, and then also not fall into the habit that we have of having the trauma experience that BIPoC folks have with racism to be the learning that white people need in order to not to learn about racism, right? So we wanted to be conscious of that, to not use their stories, right, re-traumatize to benefit white folks at the expense of the BIPoC participants. And so while in our Padlet and our Plus and Deltas, we got a lot of requests for more mixed group conversations, like we were very strategic and I think intentional about making sure that we had the intentional spaces for BIPoC folks to have to share the things that it only feels safe in our groups to do. And we knew that was pushing against maybe some of the other folks who wanted that kind of learning, but we also knew that this was a balance, and that in doing this anti-racism COP, it was just as much or maybe even more for the BIPoC participants, because we are so rarely centered in these conversations. We are so, our stories and our experiences are so exploited that we could not in good conscience create sacred space if we did not make a space sacred and safe for folks to share. And so our ability to hold that space and not move to the will of the popular, I think gave some great legitimacy to this. And in the second round, we were intentional about making sure that we had the same amount of white folks as we had BIPoC folks. And so when we first did this call, we had over 80 people sign up to be who were interested. And originally we were going to have a group of 30. We moved it to a group of 40, and we did half BIPoC and half white. For the second round, because we had so many white folks who had expressed interest, we moved those folks over and then reached out to the BIPoC participants who participated in the first one to get the participants for the second, to make sure that we still had that balance. And had we not done that in the first COP and made that space one that the BIPoC folks felt was beneficial and supportive of them and their experience, we would not have had the interest or word of mouth when we requested it for additional participants or to recommend the participation in that. So I think that was one key piece that we held on to as a really important way of centering BIPoC folks in this space. The other thing is that we all here are real people. And I, as a real person, was experiencing the illness of my mother during this time. She was in and out of the hospital. She passed away during our second COP. And I was experiencing that loss on top of the microaggressions that I experienced in Campus Compact and in the broader world. And so for me, being able to be my full self with everything that was happening to me at that time, the heaviness of what my life has been, was also a refreshing space that we need to create more of in higher education. That if we are bringing folks into this and we are asking for authenticity, right? We're asking for vulnerability, then we need to be able to take and embrace and hold space for all of that. Those experiences, that caregiving, that loss, makes me a better listener, a better leader. It helps me think and know and believe that love has to be at the center of our leadership work, and especially of our anti-racist work. And it allows me to then enter spaces where, when things don't hit right, when I know that they are causing me harm, even if the other person does not realize it, I also have the wherewithal to say something, to stand in my space and not question whether I heard it wrong or whether I'm crazy, all the things that we go through to justify the white supremacy that we are living in every day. And so I know it's not always easy to do in our spaces, but at least my commitment is in the spaces that I can create, that I invite that in. And I was lucky enough to be with colleagues who also believed in love as a leadership strategy and centering love in anti-racist work. And so, you know, this was a very powerful experience for me as a facilitator, but also to know that we created that space for the participants. Mm-hmm. That is movement work, and that is what we're doing. Here's John.
Thank you, Marisol. Sharon and Aaliyah, if it's okay with you, I'll move on to do a quick response to Marisol and tell my story. And then we'll see if we can take a few questions from all the participants. I don't remember who it was that suggested the term sacred space. It might have been you, Aaliyah, or it might have been you, Marisol. It was one of the two of you, I'm pretty sure, who said, that's what we need to create, is a sacred space to address racism. And I am reminded, listening to you just now, Marisol, how much I still have to learn about the importance of that sacred space in which each of us seeks to look as deeply as we can at the humanity of each of the rest of us and hold that in our hearts. And that's what I think we all sought to do with each other as co-facilitators, and then again with the participants. We haven't said much about the structure of what we did from week to week. We moved back and forth from meeting as a whole group of either 40 plus the four of us or 20 plus the four of us, or caucuses that divided us along racial identities, BIPoC and White, or small mixed groups. And we would do one, and then we would move into another, and then we would come back and we would move into another. And you've heard some of the reasons why having those caucuses around racial identity was so important for the BIPoC people to create a space. I got to hear not the details, but the overview from Aaliyah and Marisol about how those discussions focused a lot on healing and on coming to terms with the burdens of racist assaults that our BIPoC colleagues were experiencing every day, and finding support with one another. In the White Caucus, things were different. There was not so much a focus on healing because many of the white participants hadn't recognize themselves as being that harmed by racism. It was more one of two things as I saw it. One was, I know that I'm opposed to racism and I need to figure out how to be effective in undoing racism. Or I know that I don't like racism and I need to understand it more so that I can then think about how to be effective. We had more of the second of those in the second group. We had more of the first of those in the first group. But there was an event the very last day of our first group when one of the participants in the White Caucus, toward the end of that time for that caucus meeting, said, you know, I really don't like the fact that we've been divided from the people of color so much and spent so much time in this white people's group. And I really want to hear more from the people of color. And I also don't like the fact that we're calling people of color BIPoC. We should just have two terms, white and non-white. And I was taken aback as one of the facilitators of that caucus. And I started to respond to that. And I said a few things about why we had caucuses and why we each had work to do. And it was different in the White Caucus and in the BIPoC caucus. And this participant said, okay, I've heard enough from you, John. I want to hear from the other participants in this caucus. We had about 5 minutes left at that point. And so I thought, am I going to duke it out with this person or am I going to let the other white participants respond to him? I said, okay, folks, what would you like to say to what this person has just said? One of the women in the group said, you know, I would be really offended if I was called a non-man. So I think non-white is a really offensive term. And I don't think we should use that. BIPoC is better than that. And there were some more responses. And then we were out of time. And we came back to the whole group for a closing. And that was the end of that first community of practice. What that taught me is that no matter where I think we are in the group, in terms of our knowledge and understanding and progress with each other, it's always possible to be taken by surprise as a facilitator that, oh, this person is standing somewhere that I would not have expected. And we have to show up and respond to that. And so the folks who showed up were the other people in that group. Once he asked me to shut up, I thought they have enough understanding to respond in appropriate ways. And I think the challenge for me was, if we're trying to make a sacred space, is that space open to a participant like this one, as well as those who seem to share my understanding more fully? And I think I'll stop on that. Marisol, Sharon, Aaliyah, if you want to comment briefly on my story, go for it. And then Nicole, if you have been curating some of the questions people have put into the chat, if you could feed them back to us, that would be great. But first, Marisol, Sharon, Aaliyah, any comments?
I mean,
Sharon? Yeah.
It's just such a journey. And it was, as we said, that this should happen in the last minutes of this very full, very rich series. And underscores Aaliyah's point, you know, the work is, it's wonderful, it's powerful, it's emotionally, we had a sense how what it means to be doing this work, at least we did as white, you know, allies. And it's shocking. Aaliyah, I'm sorry, Marisol?
You know, people show themselves and that's okay. And I would rather know what I'm dealing with, right? So I mean, it's not right he told you to shut up, but I also like, we saw, right? And that's better, because I think so many times in academia, we have the pretend, right? We have the, oh yeah, you know, I'm for diversity, but then when it comes to, you know, supporting your colleague of color, right? Folks are, you know, steady the ones to dismiss them, not write good letters of support, vote against them, right? If anybody's seen the chair, right, it's all over that. And so in that sense, it allows us the space to bring it. And that was the purpose of that. So
Yeah.
Just to add to that, so there were so many of those moments. John, your story is so helpful in interpreting the moments where our jaws dropped, or, you know, we have moments where we as a community of practice had to learn very well how to read the moments of silence, the worry and the tension around even the philosophical concepts of race and racism accompanying this work. There were ideas that became greater than even our words, our thoughts around it, because of the potential of it becoming the norm. And I like to think about those moments of aha, or oh my gosh, or surprise as the learning opportunities, because over time, whiteness became the norm. At some point, it was a new idea, and thus invisible now because it's so heavily ingrained, which served as the construction site for racism to continue to occur at every turn, at every conjuncture. So when we can move past the aha, the surprise, when anti-racism can seem normal and thus perhaps invisible, maybe it will allow an avenue for justice for all. Maybe fairness and justice can get appreciated in value in higher ed when we continue to disrupt and have the ahas and the calling outs and the moments of practice of anti-racism in higher ed. So I appreciate your story as well.
Okay, I'm remembering that we had about 12 minutes of advice we were planning to share with you. We have 5 minutes left, and we haven't heard or responded to any of your questions because we've been busy talking. And of course,
let's do the questions, and maybe the advice can come through that.
Yeah. And also maybe we could write some of this up and share it with you later.
Yeah. So the first question that Nicole put in is, how do you support white people who see this as a check off their checklist without doing the actual work of doing the self-reflective work within the context of higher education? I think for me, it's not a recipe, so I don't give them recipes. Right? I don't create a recipe book. It's not like, you want to do this, then it's deeply personal and reflective. And so the kinds of trainings and spaces that are created are about that, are holding that. And so I can't say that has been the most popular thing for me, being in Campus Compact in my role, but that has been the thing that I have tried to stick to, that I'm not just going to give out checklist anti-racist badges, right? Like, even in the way that we're constructing our DEI credential, it's going to be very different from the ways that we have done other credentials, micro-credentials, because it is about you. You change you so that you can change systems.
And I would say people enter the space however they enter it. And one of the things that can be so powerful is learning how to be in dialogue with another person or in a small group. And that when many of us are in those dialogues, you realize how much you don't know and want to know. And so I think for those white folk, I think they entered it, most of them, the large majority really entered into those dialogues. They might not have known anything more than, gee, I have a lot of work to do. We heard that refrain a lot, but what that work was and how they would do it, perhaps a lot of them started with, well, you guys, you set the agenda, you lay it out, we'll just follow along. But we didn't, the way we held the space, we made suggestions, we had formats, and then we facilitated the discussion in such a way that we tried to hear all the voices. And I think as I look back, speaking of advice, and John referred to this earlier, I don't know that we could have done more than 6 sessions because people's plates are so full, but we probably could have used a few more sessions, and certainly never less than 2 hours, even when the groups were smaller. We needed that time. People needed to speak. They needed to hear other people. They needed to think, and they needed to plan going forward. And the second time around, we were able to actually help them move some of those plans going forward.
Mhm. Okay. Do we have other questions? My screen has gotten very weird and you've all mostly disappeared. So please, someone else take the lead.
Well, Nicole has said we have 1 minute.
Okay.
And we can take some of these into the next session as well. So
Okay.
I think we'll also want to give people the opportunity to have some time to get off of this Zoom and go back to the one.
Yeah. A quick close. Thank you all for coming to this breakout session. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in multiple ways with any of you who want to do that.